One of the storylines that keeps recurring during this election season is the incessant hand-wringing among the progressive left, worried about the fall of what they call our democracy. Pointing fingers, they actually make the claim that conservative evangelicals are the real threat to the survival of the American experiment. Well, let's think about that for a minute and process just what it means for democracy to be in danger. For the past 3.5 years, the federal government has acted as if it is afraid of or even contemptuous of the average American citizen. They've made promise after promise of transparency, and yet those promises always seem to fall aside with evidence that they are hiding more and more information from us. For months, if not years, they hid from us the accurate understanding of President Biden's health and his ability to govern. Calls for accountability after near routine incompetence at the highest levels of government have been met with derision and dismissiveness. President Biden himself has taunted political dissenters, telling them that they'd need F-15s to take on the government. Our democracy, we're told, is in danger because of conservatives, and yet it looks like in 2024, our democracy is increasingly an expression of the government elite's desire to hold on to power no matter what the people think. On the Democratic side of the presidential campaign, we had a candidate who went through all of the primaries, who won the nomination, only to be forced out at the last minute by the movers and shakers in the Democratic Party. They installed a new candidate that nobody's ever voted for. Makes me wonder who actually is a danger to democracy. Alexis de Tocqueville, that 19th century Frenchman who toured the United States and wrote so incisively about what he discovered here, he warned about the potential catastrophe for democracies. Listen to this. He says, society will develop a new kind of servitude which covers the surface of society with a network of complicated rules through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate. This procedural servitude, the Frenchman added, does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people till each nation is reduced to nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. In other words, the burden of control that has been placed on the populace is actually designed to produce a quiet but hardworking class that just shuts up and does what it's told. Tocqueville said it is difficult, this is a great line, he says it was difficult to imagine how men who have entirely renounced the habit of managing their own affairs could be successful in choosing those who ought to lead them. It is impossible to believe that a liberal, energetic, and wise government can ever emerge from the ballots of a nation of servants. It's interesting, we've changed the system from the original structure of the American experiment, and in the original system, only landowners were allowed to vote. Now, that was not a prejudicial decision. That was our founding fathers recognizing that only those people who had a financial stake in the policies of government should be allowed to put the government into place. Because we've changed the rules over the last 250 years, what we now find is that people who, as it were, suckle at the teat of government often line up in the voting booth simply to vote in those politicians who promise them more free stuff. Would it be radical to say that we should go back to having some standard of who is allowed to vote in this country? We have this long-held principle of one man, one vote, and yet in the history of the world, one man, one vote has never been implemented to the success of a nation because it allows people who have questionable motives and poor wisdom into the voting process. You say, well, that's a very elitist view. No, actually it's not. The elitist view says that there should be a small cabal in power, and they will stay in power by providing bread and circuses for the masses. What we need is to recover this idea of government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, for many Christians, we have been taught that we should view our vote in terms of evangelistic witness. That is, when people say, oh, I just can't vote in this election, there's just nobody for me to vote for, often they're viewing their vote as a way of establishing credibility with their friends and neighbors. In other words, I hear people say, well, if I vote for former President Donald Trump in November, won't that hinder my witness to the unbelieving world? The world, we're told, is watching. How can we vote for people who seem to be so inconsistent with the deep values that we hold? The implicit assumption is that the world is a progressive, secular, and liberal place, and thus a vote for Trump will alienate our target evangelistic audience. The reality is, we're often told that voting for a candidate entails a complete and total endorsement of every aspect of that candidate, from his entire platform to his personal behavior. That's why people will say that a vote for Trump constitutes an endorsement of everything he has ever done or said. The principle that is often attached there is a not so subtle guilt by association, which refuses to distinguish between motives for performing the same political action. Let me tell you what I mean. In the ancient world, a Christian theologian who was a powerful, innovative writer about political theory was St. Augustine. He was faced in a generation with a theological group called the Donatists. The Donatists argued that the sacraments or the practices of the ordinances in the church were rendered invalid if the officiating priest was known to be involved in sin. Most crucially, the sin of denying Christ under persecution. You see, in the ancient world, if a pastor was arrested, if he was tortured and eventually denied Christ under the pressure of that harassment and persecution, the church often had restrictions for how quickly they could come back into the church, how they could be restored. The Donatists said they can't be restored, and not only can they not be restored, but all of the people baptized by those now compromised pastors are essentially now unbaptized. In other words, the effect of their sin had such a ripple that it undid everything that they ever did in their life that was considered valuable. Today we have what I would call political Donatists who are adamant that they avoid any association with candidates who have some sort of compromising character or political qualities. This obsession with the individual purity of the person leads to poor political thinking. In the same way that Augustine argued that one cannot entirely separate from sinners in either the church or the civil sphere, he says we have to think about when we are actually made guilty by our support of a political candidate. Let me give you his standards. First, he said a person can be corrupted in an association in which he joins in the act of sinning. In other words, to be in conspiracy with a sinner is to be complicit and guilty of that sin. Secondly, he said one is corrupted in an association when one consents to another's sin, such as expressing explicit approval of that sin or helping them to commit the sin or trying to shield them from the legitimate penalties of their sin. The third guilty state is when one is complicit because he is in an official position in relation to the sinner and he fails to rebuke the sinner for committing a public sin. Now, thinking about that, first of all, Augustine's first category is not relevant to us because when we vote for someone, you are not directly acting with them to accomplish any particular act. You are, as a voter, making a calculated judgment about the relative merits of the package of potential acts and consequences of a candidate's administration. Therefore, the mere act of voting does not join a political leader in his personal sin. Secondly, he says, well, voting for a candidate implies the explicit approval of their sin. Voting for a candidate that you know has character flaws and policy positions with which you strongly disagree does not make you directly complicit in those flaws or those policies. However, it is important that you don't allow your vote to be defended by stepping up and defending those actions or policies or sins on the part of that person. We must not lose our ability to speak prophetically just because we vote for one party or the other. The third category doesn't apply at all because we are not in a high profile or official capacity that allows us to publicly endorse a candidate. Therefore, we have to face this challenge. How do we vote in what is essentially a binary option? I know there are Christians who say, well, I'm going to vote third party or I'm not going to vote at all. You've heard me say before that to not vote at all is not an option. We are charged by God to be involved, to hold the responsibilities of citizenship as salt and light in this culture. So not voting is not an option. In our system of basically binary voting, a third party vote of a candidate who is clearly not viable is as good as not voting at all. So that leaves us with this challenge. Do we vote Republican or do we vote Democrat? Politics is messy and we can make mistakes, but we must engage in the process. We've got to come to grips with the fact that there is no such thing in our system as a happy voter. In fact, if you're waiting for a presidential race where you can vote for anybody that you are 100% on board with and you agree with every policy and this is the greatest person to ever come along, you will never vote again because you will never see a candidate like that, ever. By definition, our candidates are flawed. They're sinful human beings. The best we can do is to engage in the process of what is clearly a messy business called politics. And we make the best choice that we can based on what will be the greatest possible outcome for the direction of the nation. In other words, we vote for the candidate, the presidential candidate, that is most likely to do one very important thing. The Apostle Paul wrote to his protege, Timothy, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, and this is what he says. He says, first of all, then, I urge that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made in behalf of all people, for kings and all who are in authority, so that, listen, anytime in the New Testament you see so that, that's a single word in Greek, and it's always an important word because it says everything that I've just told you, here's the reason why. Paul says, I want you to pray for kings and all who are in authority. I want you to spend time before the throne of grace praying for politicians so that, this is it, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. Here's what it comes down to. Which candidate is most likely to leave us alone so that we can live the life that God has called us to? You have to figure that out for yourself. But I tell you, for me, the party of control and intervention, the party of suppressing freedom of speech, the party of requiring lockstep obedience to policies that are ungodly, the party that wants government to tax excessively, the party that wants to have no borders so that our system of our social services network is overwhelmed. The Democratic Party is least likely to create a culture where we can lead tranquil and quiet lives of godliness. Now, the Republicans aren't a lot better, but in this instance, even a little better is still better. Don't be a political Donatist. Don't sit on the sidelines waiting for the perfect candidate. Figure out how to pray for our leaders and then vote for the one most likely to produce a culture where you and I can live tranquil and quiet lives of godliness and be the salt and light that we've been called to be. The election's coming up soon. Before we go to the voting booth, we need to go to the prayer closet because a nation is at stake. This is Truth Currents.